Hi, everyone. Just before we get started, I would like to begin by acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today. We pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Welcome everyone to this in-person event, which is exciting. We've done a lot of this discussion of this topic online. My name is Ngaire Crawford. I'm the Executive Director of AI Strategy at Isentia. I'm super excited to introduce our panel this morning, but before I do that, a couple of housekeeping notes. The bathrooms are up the stairs, but you walk towards the lift and they're opposite the coffee shop, just in case anybody needs to know that. We will try and wrap up by midday today. I will talk to our lovely panel for about 45 minutes, and then we will open the floor to all of you for all of your questions. So if you have any questions, do hold them to the end. Just a quick note, though, that we are filming this session. We will circulate the recording, but if there's anything that you want to ask that maybe you want to ask anonymously, maybe do it after we're doing that. So I guess we do have a little late lineup change today. Unfortunately, Megan Senior from Ausgrid is unable to join us this morning, but we're very lucky to have Kristian Gaupset from Ausgrid, who is the Senior External Communications Lead. So thank you, Kristian, for joining us today. I'm going to introduce all of our wonderful panelists. I'm very excited this morning because I spend a lot of time talking about AI. I used to lead our research teams for a very long time, so I love to have discussions about this topic. We have such a wonderful panel this morning. I'm going to read their bios out and try not to not get anything wrong, and give them all of the flowers that they deserve, because they are three very fascinating people with three really great perspectives on this topic. So firstly, as I mentioned, we do have Kristian, the Senior External Communications Lead from Ausgrid. He leads executive communications at Ausgrid, one of Australia's largest electricity distributors, where he advises the leadership team on stakeholder, reputational and political messaging. Prior to his work at Ausgrid, he spent more than a decade at the Seven Network, holding several senior positions across news and current affairs. So thank you for joining us today. Petra Buchanan is a qualified board director, strategic advisor and former CEO with global experience strengthening organisational performance and governance across the media, technology and for-purpose sectors. Petra is currently a non-executive director of the Australasian Medical Publishing Company and strategic advisor to Women in Media Australia. And she's also a recipient of the AFR 100 Women of Influence Award and the BNT Women in Media Mentor Award. We also have Lisa Main. Lisa specialises in the impact of AI on our information environment and advises organisations on information risk. As a journalist, Lisa played a founding role at ABC Fact Check and produced award-winning international investigations. So as you can see, some really great perspectives to dive into this discussion today. So I guess the why behind this discussion is that we know that communications is heavily anchored to believability. And being believed is getting harder and harder. There's more noise. Convincing content is cheaper to produce. And there are now really opaque AI information structures sitting between you and your audiences. And how you earn credibility has gone from that somewhat quiet, steady work in the background to being this really loud centerpiece question within organisations. So even if just thinking about the last time you saw something online and you weren't quite sure if it was real, and it's that half a second and it's that hesitation is really where there is a lot of hard work to do, because that little bit of doubt is part of every interaction now. So there's a big challenge there that we're going to get into today, but where there's challenge, there's always a lot of opportunity. So in, I guess, a positive framing, my very first question to our panelists today, and Lisa, we might start with you, is if you can think of an organisation or a person that you genuinely trust right now and what it is that they're doing to earn that trust.
Oh, that's a great question. I think I'm actually going to jump across the Atlantic. I'm going to go to the UK and an organisation called Full Fact.
Mhm.
There are organisations here, but I like what Full Fact are doing. They're doing the heavy lifting in establishing what is a fact base in an information environment that is just full of misinformation. And they do the hard work and they show their homework. And if facts change over the time, they change over time as well. So they're kind of providing that essential kind of, bottom line evidence base into the information system. But then they're also opening the discussion around how do we surface more quality information, because we know we live in an information environment where structurally the bad stuff is actually elevated well above the good stuff.
So it's the part that you love, the fact that they sort of show the working and show that evidence.
Yeah, and I see this in Sydney Morning Herald journalists as well. They'll jump on, their little LinkedIn videos and they'll say, I just did this investigation. This is where I got the numbers from. This is how we crunched them. This is what we found. And this is what we didn't know. So I think, I'm really liking that trend in journalism where people are starting to show their homework. And I think that builds trust because, there's transparency.
Yeah, Kristian, how about you?
Might bring us a little closer to home. My one's about Australia Post, and it's an anecdotal story. Cast all our minds back when the first round of US tariffs first came into effect. My partner, she runs a small business, and her main customer base is North America. And we woke up on the morning that the US tariffs were announced, and it was absolute chaos. And in the inbox already on day one was a message, an email from Australia Post to all the Australia Post business customers. And the subtext of the message was essentially, we've woken up to the exact news that you've read as well. We have no idea what this means. We're working through it right now. We don't have a solution yet, but we're working tirelessly to find one. We will keep you updated and in the loop. And I just found that the message contained nothing. There was no result. There was no substance to it besides the fact that we hear you, we understand what you're going through, and we're doing our absolute best to try and find a solution for you. And we won't leave you out in the cold. In terms of information, we'll keep you covered. And I felt that it made us feel so trusting of that organization in that moment, even though they hadn't come up with any solutions. It wasn't something that they had done apart from being able to communicate effectively in a crisis, that they didn't know what was happening, but they were committed to solving it.
Did they continue to communicate really well, or was it the...
Yeah, it was fantastic. They set up, there was a successive email where they, said if anyone has any questions, there's a hotline that you can call where you can talk to an Australian member of the Australia Post team. They'll talk you through any questions that you have. We did make use of that service, and they were just as candid. They were like, hey, we're finding out what this means, and there's been changes in the margins still, and we're working with a third-party supplier to try find a way to be able to allow you to logistically ship items to North America again, which at this stage you currently can't.
Yeah.
So it was a process that they walked through along with their customers, and I thought that was hugely beneficial in terms of building trust for them in a scenario where they had the potential to have trust really eroded.
Yeah, Petra, what about you?
A little bit more about an individual. The Governor General, Her Excellency Sam Mostyn, I think over the period of her tenure, she has been so accessible and trying to create much more awareness about what is the role of the Governor General. I've been to various functions where, I think now as an individual, whether it's in politics or otherwise, you've really got to figure out how do you take a selfie? And she seems to jump out there. And I've literally, in the beginning of her tenure, seen how I think people on her staff were fundamentally just horrified because it's usually, very process-driven. The Governor General has a role to play. It's done in a certain way. All of these things, there is protocol. And I think that she is really wiping away a lot of that and building a contemporary view of what it means to be in that role, making it accessible and really just personalizing it. So I think she's doing good job.
I think, Petra, we might stay with you. I think there's a really interesting thing that's coming through around transparency that I think is probably, not unknown to people in this room. But I think in your experience, I think on boards and in that strategic advisor role, how differently do you find that those spaces and those senior leadership and executive and board level teams, how are they talking about trust and reputation and credibility compared to a few years ago? What feels different about those conversations?
I think it's speed, transparency. There is just so much scrutiny now. Historically, I think boards and executive teams generally looked retrospectively. We looked at brand reports, we looked at media coverage over the past quarter, maybe 6 monthly cycles, all of these kind of things that you could point to some statistics, some data that would lead you to a point in time. And so there was a cyclical nature to it. Now everything is real time. So that increased scrutiny happens because of transparency, which is great. But what it means in the boardroom is that it's now a very live governance issue and it's a risk issue. And so that change from moderating and time and looking at things in cycles becomes real time, and it becomes a real governance problem for organizations.
So do you find it to be far more of that liveness, does it make it a more central focus in those discussions as well?
I think it makes it real time versus being a point on the agenda.
Okay. I think, Kristian, your experience in executive communications, do you find some of that echoes true, that element of liveness or needing to change the way that the language exists around credibility for those leaders?
Yeah, definitely. And I think you always have to keep in mind the environment that you're operating in. I'm in the electricity space. Obviously, with the energy transition, it's an environment which is shifting very, very rapidly. We don't always have all the answers. And I think the thing about trust is building a rapport with the communities that you serve, being able to have the courage to admit when you don't have all the answers because the situation is a live one that is being worked through and you're keeping them updated. I think that's a great way of building trust, because although it does take some extent of bravery to be able to come out and admit what you don't know, your customers and communities and the people that you serve will pay you back in the form of trust.
Staying with that, I guess, community and stakeholders, what do you think has got much harder about that job of maintaining trust in the last few years, and what some of the things that you think might be behind that?
I think in the space that we're in, you have an enormous amount of different stakeholders, and the two big ones are government and then the communities that you serve. And what we're seeing now is, government is, as government always is, very methodical, wants to process things through the due process that is very important, that needs to happen that way. But customers and communities are shifting. They want information in real time. They want to be updated far, far more quickly. And so you have an environment where you're giving two speeds of communication and information to two different stakeholder groups, which is fine in isolation, but when they converge, and you might be managing, an incident, in our case, a storm, when you have both sets wanting updates and to be kept abreast of what's going on, you really have to articulate it very carefully to both stakeholder groups, knowing that it's not a one-size-fits-all. Both need a tailored brief of information and need to be kept up to speed with a different cadence and with different information of one another. So being able to acknowledge the environment that you're operating in and tailor your communications on the fly, I think, is probably the most valuable thing in an environment which is constantly shifting.
So that the transparency that we've all been signalling is it's a value, but it's also one of the challenges, right, of just being able to constantly give people the right information at the right time.
Definitely, 100%. It's a challenge that we deal with every single day, and that we don't always get right, but we learn from our mistakes. We talk to our peers, in different regions. We learn from their mistakes. We share information in the hope that we collectively will all do a better job, which is the end goal of serving the communities better.
Yeah. Lisa, I think to maybe shift away from communicating with people, but talking a little bit more about trust and credibility of information. It's a big question I'm going to throw at you. Is trust in information, is it actually collapsing, or is it just moving somewhere else?
That's actually a really good question. I think it's complicated. So if you look at the kind of mega trends, it certainly looks like trust is declining, and it has done over the last 20 years, which I would say is absolutely not surprising once you look under the hood and understand the information environment. So yes, it is, but there are also some really interesting divergent trends. And I think on a positive note, there was one yesterday where the Reuters news report was released, and it found that young people in Australia, the age between 24 and 35, are actually driving subscriptions in trusted news. And as a result, their trust levels in news has jumped like, I think it was 14 basis points, and it's now the highest cohort that holds trust in news. So what I read on that is that people actually do want to they want trust. Like, we need trust to be able to just function in our daily lives, in our jobs. The challenge is that we operate in this information environment that is opaque, not transparent, not accountable. It's a great place for bad actors to manipulate and to cause trouble. And we see lots of that. And we see it a lot in the climate debates in Australia. I work with organisations where the traffic on all of their social media sites is between 30 and 40% of fake bots who are only amplifying negative sentiment. So, I would say that the landscape is incredibly challenging. I think what is happening is trust isn't moving or collapsing, but it's being disrupted. Like, how do I know what to trust? That is being disrupted right now. And I'll pull up there, but I think that's the challenge.
Yeah, I think that a few of us attended the launch of the digital news report yesterday, and I think it will be really interesting to see how that statistic holds on that subscription and the interest that younger people have in news. I think there's an interesting expansive definition of news in some of the reporting, and sometimes point in time research is influenced by other things. It was in field not too long after the incident in Bondi. So it'll be interesting to see how much of that might naturalize or not in terms of sources and trust in them. I think staying on that point a little bit, Kristian, where is it that you think that trust and credibility might get kind of won or lost? Is it in those, big set piece moments? Is it in a statement or a campaign, or is it these sort of smaller, less visible actions that an organisation might be taking?
I feel it's decisively the smaller moments. Mm-hmm. It's that repetition of an expected outcome that a community or a customer will associate with your organisation or brand. For us, it's, imagine you wake up in the morning, it's still dark, you're getting ready for work, you go into the bathroom, you don't say a little prayer before you flick the light switch on, because you flick it on every morning and the lights come on. That's trust. You trust that light to come on because it has worked so many times before. You don't trust that light to come on because of some campaign that you saw that we run saying that your light will turn on when you flick the switch. It's the repetition, and trust is fantastic, but it's something of a lagging indicator. You earn the trust after the repetition put in day after day after day of good results, so that you get to a stage where the customer or the community that you're serving expects a certain positive outcome from you, and that's when the trust follows.
Mm-hmm. I think if we're taking that idea and moving it to some of the spaces that you work in, Petra, and you mentioned it before around those traditional, historical views of tracking reputation through surveys. We're obviously just talking about a survey with the digital news report, looking at media coverage, but there is now this first impression of an organisation that might come through an LLM or an AI tool and how they summarize information. Is that something you see as being on the radar in any of the conversations you have? Is it something that's considered, or might still be a bit of a blind spot?
It's emerging, I would say, and it's something that both leadership as well as then board need to be more aware of, more engaged with. I think in many instances at those senior levels, there's awareness for AI as a productivity tool, as a workforce implementation tool. What is it going to mean to, human capital? Those kind of conversations are happening. So at almost a technical level, it's kind of like how we think about cybersecurity. So, tend to think hardware before sort of implementation flow down to the softer spaces. And so I think that boards in particular and management teams need to really lean into what does AI reputation mean. And so understanding how, whether it's large language models, all of this culmination of inputs, what does it actually mean for the business? What does it mean for how leaders are seen in the business? And what does it mean for the brand more generally? So I think it really has to be that confluence of all of those sources coming together. And I think that, as I say, it's emerging. It's not there on everyone's radar. I think that the speed, kind of my constant theme around a lot of these issues is just how in your face so much of this is today. It's confronting at both, an organizational level from the junior most person to the senior most person. And I think we're all dealing with it in real time. Some come to things quicker than others. Some come to them in fuller and more dimensional ways of thinking about it. And we need to make sure that it is on the agenda and that it is something that we're looking at with as many tools so that we're not just being reactive and responsive, responding to one critical issue or one thing in isolation.
We've found that in some of the conversations that we've been having with our client base is that there is this interesting kind of top-down tension with AI that we haven't necessarily seen with other technologies or formats, where you can have an executive team or a leadership team that's really tightly engaged with AI are using, have the highest level of license in their Copilot or their Claude, and it's not necessarily translated down through the organization. Is that something that I think any of you are seeing from, I guess, an assumption or a misunderstanding about the role or use or reputation of AI and how it's translating through an organization?
What I'm seeing based on the organizations I'm involved with is that scale matters. So if you're a small to medium-sized business and your workflows, you've got a process driven, it might be a consumer driven way in which you engage, and and you can see the workflow and how to automate that using AI and really bring benefit to your business, you're going to do it. What a lot of organizations, again, depending on that scale, if you're sitting at the smaller size of things, is that you're not actually sure if process is actually going to create benefit. And then what does it mean afterward? You're committed to systems and flows and other things. So there's a lot of just actually understanding your business and understanding at what point in our business should we be implementing AI as a tool? Where do we take this out of the hands of individuals and put it at a systems level? And then you look at bigger organizations, whether it's many of the banks, which came out early and strong and then had to sort of pull back a bit, saying, we're embracing AI, we're spending billions of dollars, we're going to make these levels of redundancy. And then they start to implement, and it's a ebb and a flow of like how it should work. Where do the guardrails need to be? So I think that there's real differential in terms of both senior management understanding and trust in the on-flow of what AI should mean in an organization, as well as the ability to pay for those things and implement. We are spending as organizations a lot of money, much more so. We are seeing the balance sheets of businesses change dramatically because of what they have to invest in infrastructure to implement. AI programs and initiatives, and then to sustain those when it is such a moving feast, we don't know what we're actually committing to down the track. So these are the kind of queries that are happening in senior management levels, where then it may be a junior level in a business, you might be just wondering when something's going to change, or is that project going to get implemented? So it's trying to bring those things together in real time.
Yeah, Lisa, when we were talking earlier, you had a really lovely piece of advice for executive teams around their poor communications teams in and amongst that kind of change.
Yeah, my advice when I'm always talking to senior leadership teams is have mercy on your communications teams right now. They are under the pump. It's a really fast moving, changing environment, and it's very opaque. Most organizations don't have the intelligence capabilities to be able to understand fully how their brand, their reputation, a whole range of things are being discussed on, an infinite amount of social platforms at any one time. And so understanding where, a spike might come or where reputation harm might come from, let alone how to respond to that, is really challenging. So, yeah, I think it's a real time and an opportunity, I think, for corporate affairs teams to really re-engage and reinvent their kind of body of work and their place in an organization.
Kristian, how does that feel for you as a practitioner? Does that ring true? Does it feel a little bit differently on the ground?
First of all, thank you for the support. Look, I think it's something that's not unique to corporate communications functions. It's something that's felt through a number of areas of the business, particularly, I know, our customer call center, who are the first line of contact between a lot of our customers and communities that we serve. They're constantly fielding calls, and the accessibility of information, and on the other side of the coin, misinformation, has never been easier for the general public to obtain. All of a sudden, you can pump a prompt into your LLM of choice, and it will put together a highly summarized, highly technical summary for you that arms you with an enormous amount of information that would have taken you months and months and months to put together. And you can pick up the phone as an informed member of the public, and hopefully the information that you got out of your LLM is 100% correct. And if it's not, I do feel for the customer call center teams that are having to try and tell people that what you may have been told by wherever you got this information is not necessarily correct. So I think there's a lot of grace that needs to go into how we approach these conversations, and be understanding and be mindful again of the environment that we're operating in, and that it is one that is shifting fastly beneath our feet.
Yeah, I think to pick up on the point around people calling up with information that they may have sourced from an LLM or any other kind of AI model. Lisa, there is an element to some of this idea of synthetic content and how information travels, and that sometimes the true version of a story is often the most boring version of a story, and the false versions are the ones that feel engaging and feel fun. In that attention economy idea, how does truth compete in that space?
Look, with great difficulty. I mean, I think that we need to, as a society, move away from this idea that every piece of information needs to be entertainment. And it's like if you put a child in a lolly shop, that kid is going to eat all of the lollies because it's instant gratification. And that's how our information system is now designed, because it's designed for maximum time, for your maximum attention. So it knows a lot about you through all of your digital footprint, and it is targeting back at you to elicit your maximum attention all the time. So we are that kid in the lolly shop. In the long term, if we eat all those lollies, it's not good for us. And I feel that there needs to be a bit of a mindset shift of sometimes we just need to be informed, and we just got to eat a few information vegetables, and that's okay. That's just part of being a citizen in a modern, highly technological environment. So yeah, I think there certainly are opportunities to make, high quality content in formats that are much more appealing for audiences that work in short form. And there's some really interesting kind of pilots and ideas around how we do that at scale, because that's the trick. If you do it but don't do it at scale, you will not win.
I feel like you might need to get eat your information vegetables on some kind of merch somewhere. I think if we flip that a little bit and talk, Kristian, if I want to come to you and talk about transparency around communicating about AI and the use of AI, and potentially getting something wrong, as you were saying earlier. Do you think that admission of when either those outputs are wrong or you as an organization are wrong, is that something that still builds trust, or are audiences becoming sort of too skeptical about any communication that even when you are being transparent, they're not interested?
I'll address the AI section in the second half of this. I think, yes, people are becoming more skeptical, but I think we have to ask ourselves why. And I think they're becoming more skeptical because they've never been more informed. I think that in that environment, people are expecting transparency because they're already armed with so much knowledge. They already know the answer before you, they're asking, before you even give it to them. It's almost like a test. Are you going to give me the answer that I know is right so that I can trust you? So I think that in response to that, our communication, yes, transparency is just as effective as it always was, if not more so. But I think that the transparency, it has to be genuine. It can't be performative. It has to be you showing up if you have been wrong, admitting when you're wrong, and if there is misinformation, correcting it with grace. When it comes to the use of AI, I think from a practitioner's point of view, I think it depends entirely on what you're using it for. I think I think it's generally expected that a lot of people in the professional world are using AI in some capacity, whether it's putting together a first draft or helping them do a bit of research. I think the issue becomes if you don't disclose it, if you're using AI to deliver a finished final product. Now, I think there are genuine scenarios where you would use AI to deliver a final product. I think they're quite limited. I think when you're delivering something to a customer, I think they're far more in tune now. They've caught on to what's AI and what's not. And if you're not disclosing it and they're seeing it, they're like, that's AI, and you haven't disclosed that. I think that's where you get into trouble. It's not the using the AI that's the issue. It's the failure to disclose if that's what you're doing.
Do you think organizations are held to a different standard around that transparency? So if you've got, people calling up having used AI and saying, I've got my facts right, do you think that their expectation about organizations being transparent is very different to their expectations of themselves?
You mean that they feel like they don't have to disclose where they got it from? Oh, look, I feel for yeah. Look, I think at the end of the day, some may, some won't. I feel really for GPs. The amount of people that must come in. They're like, I think I have this issue. I think I have this illness, and they come through with a suspiciously large document of files of what they think is wrong with them, and the GP's like, have you maybe asked ChatGPT what you think is wrong, or should we probably do some tests?
Powerful combination of.
I think it's an interesting one for sure.
I might actually just add to that, because I think, we see people definitely coming with their own evidence. I was talking to a medical practitioner who said, I'm seeing people coming in saying, I won't take this particular vaccine and I've got my own evidence. And I think one of the things that we also have to grapple with is how our information environment is changing our cognitive processes. And there was a very interesting study done, which goes to your point about why we need to, with care, engage with people who may seem as if they're, wildly misinformed. But there was a study done recently which had a look at all of a cohort of people who believed that Donald Trump was an honest guy and that he was telling the truth. And they were like, how can that be true when we know that he told, over 30,000 lies in his first term? Like, how can that be true? And what the researchers found was that people were discarding this old cognitive process of here are facts, and then I have a mental frame, and I come to, an alignment of what is truth or what's not. They are pushing that aside and finding this alternative. They call it authentic self-belief. I believe he's telling the truth, and that is enough. And that norm is actually being kind of perpetuated in our information environment. We used to have a thing called the pub test where people kind of get called out on that. Well, now you can sit in your own echo chamber and that can be reinforced. And so I think we are, in an environment where there are a lot of people who are kind of misinformed, and they have adopted those misinformed facts actually as beliefs. And then dislodging those beliefs is incredibly hard. It's easy to get there, but it's really hard to come out. So, I really liked what you said about, having grace and care when you're dealing with, customers or people who may seem wildly misinformed. There's a good reason why.
Yeah, I think that's a really it's a challenging framework to communicate within. I think typically when something feels like it's becoming scarce, like credible information, that would typically make it more valuable. But that's not necessarily what we're seeing. But where would you see the opportunity in what you're describing for communicators? How could they navigate around it?
I really like the conversations around transparency. I think, that's the first part, because when you have transparency, you can have accountability. And I think that's important. I think speed, being able to, adopt to this information landscape that operates in seconds, if not hours. And I think being able to think about what does your storytelling, what does your communication look like when it hits the information environment? How do you get quality information out there that's timely and at a scale that's going to compete in the information environment? So I think that's a challenge for us, is how do we surface it and how do we scale high quality information?
Have you seen anyone doing that successfully?
I've seen some pilots just last week where it was a science pilot where they were putting in they were trying to get around what do we do about all of these influencers that are telling everybody, or that people are believing now, that sunscreen gives you cancer. And if you kind of work with academics, they have this long pipeline before they can agree, let alone kind of push something out. So they went, how can we adopt the kind of influencer production timeline to fact base? And there's some good ideas coming up. What they're doing is they're putting all of their kind of fact-based evidence into a database and getting the good influencers, the responsible influencers, to just operate out of that information fact base. And then hopefully, governments can go to platforms and say, okay, these particular influencers are operating from a known fact base around important health issues. Can you give us some guarantee that the algorithm, will kind of surface them as much as the more harmful information? So that's one idea.
Can I jump in there? I think it leads to an interesting area that we all need to be mindful of, which is intellectual property rights in all of this discussion, because when information sits behind paywalls and in proprietary ways in which, as producers need to and want to, and those that are creators want to own their product and be appropriately compensated for it, it's hard though, because in that instance, Lisa, that you're talking about, I just go, I want all of those, that scientifically peer-reviewed information that sits in academia, that sits elsewhere, but a lot of that is paywalled, and a lot of that is not therefore being pumped into LLMs. And, this is a conundrum right now, and we are literally looking at it from a regulatory standpoint here in Australia, and we need to be worldwide. How do we ensure copyright? How do we make sure artists and other creators, but equally academic information, scientific information? Because if we've got all the systems out there and everyone is under the pretense that, well, it should just be in AI. If I put it out there and I query it appropriately, and I write my prompt correctly, which we won't even get into how to do that, right? But that it should go to this repository of everything and come back to me, and that's something that I think is going to be evolving in short order.
Yeah, I think it also speaks to that transparency element as well, is that we know that particularly AI companies not required to be transparent about how they've sourced information or trained models, and everybody's grappling with what are the things that actually feed those sources, and it's not entirely well understood that in this part of the world, because of the copyright restrictions around media content and licensed content particularly, what feeds those models is typically more industry and newsletter and review sites that may not be the places where you keep your most accurate information. I think, just to stay with you, Petra, if you were advising a leader right now on how to really earn a level of credibility rather than trying to present in a certain way or manufacture it, what do you think is the most underrated thing that they might be and that's worth them investing in?
Consistency.
Mm-hmm.
It's so basic. Show up, do it regularly, talk about your, what is your intention through those channels and means? Why are you communicating on what topic? What is your purpose in being there and being present? Is it to inform? Is it to be seen as the most credible person on a particular topic? Is it to represent and be the leader of your business? So I think consistency, but I also think you need to, in that context, really understand that just you as an individual showing up and being credible and, articulate, personable, all of these things that are now added pressures on leaders in business that just, you might have had your most introverted, intellectual, amazing, person leading a company that now needs to front up and, impress in different ways. How are you developing those skills? And that comes back to all of you. I think this is a point in time for communications people across the spectrum to really step in, to assist, to guide, to help to nurture talent in individuals that may not see themselves as that needing to be their role or responsibility. I think they actually need the guiding touch of senior communications people. I was really pleased to see a Wall Street Journal article just in the past week that was talking about the American environment, but really pushing chief communications officers into the C-suite as being those guided, trusted individuals, even over, for so long, they've been sort of subsumed under marketing comms or otherwise, and now really seeing those roles as so crucial, because it is about aligning both, the customer service conflict issues, it's aligning product sales issues, it's aligning staff and culture and employee engagement issues, all of these messages that are so crucial. So I think it's not only individuals understanding what their role is in those environments and being really consistent. Don't try to do everything. Just do a few things and be consistent and do them really well and build a bit of a reputation as the person that does that in how you show up, but get good advice. Have someone on your team that's there to guide you and to pull you back and go, hey, was it, I'm trying to remember which fast food chain where the CEO was eating the hamburger and you're like, that's not your laneway. Clearly, you didn't do it with authenticity. You looked like you were nervous and not comfortable eating a hamburger. So you need somebody in those moments to say, that's actually not what we should be doing with you. Yes, competitor B may want to do that because that's the guy to do it. But let's have you in a different environment.
Does that ring true for you, Kristian, as someone who works with executive leaders on how they communicate?
Definitely, and coincidentally, I read the same article actually, which was good. And I think the other side of that as well is that elevating up to that C-suite level, it brings communicators and corporate affairs functions into the conversation from day one. And when you're in the room, when the conversation is happening on day one, and when the strategies are being fleshed out, you're not being brought in the back end to communicate something that it would have been really valuable if you had some steer or input that would have really elevated it. But it's already baked in now. It's already been signed off by everyone, and that you don't really have any capacity to shape it. So when I read that article, I thought this is, it really is a step in the right direction, because us as communicators, like, we're often the custodians of the voice of our organization. It's what our customers are hearing, and if we're brought in from day one and given the chance to be able to help shape it, you end up with a better product at the end.
Yeah, it is very much, there is a real opportunity at the moment, I think, to galvanise what's been a call for a long time around communications presence at the top table and at the C-suite level. And there is this, because of this hyper focus on reputation and its role in AI, there is this little inflection point to be able to really step into that space. I think with one of the things we are seeing with executive communications and leadership communications is a return to technical voices rather than really personable voices. So someone that communicates really well and can develop a rapport and have a great personal connection with an audience isn't necessarily what audiences are valuing anymore. What they are valuing is the presentation of facts and information and things that they feel like they can verify. Kristian, when we were speaking the other day, you were talking about how you deal with a lot of quite technical voices in a lot of the spaces that you work in. Is that something that you are seeing a shift in? Have you always had to deal with quite technical expertise and reshaping it, or are you seeing a desire for more technical information?
I think so, and I think as well that it's the fact that it's highly technical information. I'm lucky enough that I get to work with so many incredibly intelligent people that know their craft so well. I'm not an electrical engineer. I learn what I can from them, but I find that instead of technical teams imparting information to communicators and then us doing the communication, sometimes it can actually be best and more authentic and more transparent to do it the other way around. Being able to tool the technical teams and school them in, the ways of communication, and being able to front up some of our best spokespeople in our organization are people on the technical teams who are just absolutely fantastic because they know what they're talking about. They know their topic. They know the answer to any question that you could possibly ask them. And by being able to give them the confidence to be able to stand in front of a camera or go on radio or, front up wherever they're needed, it's more accurate, and two, it's more genuine because you're hearing from the people that are actually doing this on a day-to-day basis. Not to take anything away from us as communications professionals, but sometimes the role that we play, the most valuable role that we can play, is to step back and be able to empower others to do our jobs for us and be able to, instead of doing the talking, being able to step back and provide the advice, I think is where we can really add value.
How have you had to deal with any, resistance from those technical voices? Because sometimes that is a scary situation to be put in, and how do you navigate that with them?
Yeah, honestly, sometimes you have to drag them kicking and screaming for the first time to do it because it's terrifying putting yourself out there. It's terrifying putting yourself into an environment where you're being judged. It's not something that these people are often used to. The cadence of their work, the nature of their work is very, very different. But it's been funny to watch a lot of them who we really did not want to do it at the start, now cannot get enough. Like, when can I go back on TV again? When can I, when can I be doing this? When can I be doing that? And it's really lovely to take someone whose field has always been in such a narrow channel and see them really fall in love with, your side of the business, something that they had never really been exposed to before. And, I just feel like being able to play a part in that has been, that journey has been wonderful.
I think before I turn it over to the room for questions, I've got a couple of questions for all of you. I would really like to know, and maybe Lisa, we'll start with you, if there's any, I guess, a conventional piece of wisdom about building trust that you think now might just be wrong or needs to be rewritten a little bit.
That's a tough question. I actually think trust is a relationship that you have. Trust happens in all of the small, tiny moments, as you said, as you build up. Trust is about having coherence under pressure and consistency. And if you look at the evidence through the COVID, there was a spike in trust when COVID hit in our politicians. But as we started to have to process uncertainty and ambiguity and different messages, trust dropped. So I guess my question is, what do we have to think is maybe let's pull the focus off trust, not that that's not where we want to land a little bit, and let's just focus on the mechanics of what gets us there, which is that transparency, accountability, and consistency and coherence over time. That's how I'd answer that question, I think.
Yeah, it's good. I think there is an element of, we're all saying trust and credibility and reputation and all of these things so much that they do become a little bit benign, and we forget that there's a whole process to actually get there.
And that process is being manipulated and disrupted. Like there's a lot of bad activity there. So yeah, I would say let's focus on the building blocks of trust.
What about for you, Kristian?
Building on what Lisa said, I think the idea of a trust campaign being your first line of building trust is a trust campaign is like a magnifying glass. It amplifies what's already there. If you haven't put in the effort and built the trust through the repetition, you can't amplify something that doesn't exist. So I think it's a nice to have after the fact. But going back to what I said earlier, trust is the work that you put in each day, building that up. And then your trust campaign is like, the money in the bank at the end. Like you don't get paid beforehand. Like you put the work in first and then you get the results afterwards. So I think that's probably the biggest thing. As the environment shifts and people become more and more informed, they're getting more and more clued into a disingenuous trust campaign. They're like, I know what you're doing here. I'm not going to be sold. I know what you're doing.
Petra?
Yeah, I agree with everything that's been mentioned. I think trust is the outcome, right? It's not what we design a campaign necessarily to achieve. It's what gets built over time. And I think that in an AI environment, what we're looking towards is, where we can open our feeds and there's going to be tremendous amount of AI generated content. It's individuals that have a voice, that have a genuine opinion, that have made judgment in coming to what they view as important. Those are the things that build trust. And that is the human element that is so important in all of that as well.
So I think to end on a positive note and a more of a Pollyanna-y note before I turn to the room for questions, I think what we've talked a lot about transparency and being able to seize the opportunity and influence C-suites and influence organizations. What are some of the other opportunities that you think exist in this more disruptive space for communicators right now? Petra, we might start with you.
I think the opportunity is, quite honestly, that better companies, it will create opportunities for not just better communications. It's like the companies that are doing the right thing, that are ethically grounded, that are motivated by their staff, that are engaging appropriately with their audiences. All of those things, we have these channels, these opportunities now that all gets bundled into this impression that comes out in this amalgam of AI. And the more that there is truth in each of those, as we have discussed, means that you're not manipulating it. And in an environment where validation, questioning, and this greater scrutiny is at play, if at the beginning, in the core of what you are doing as a business is grounded in being a good business, your job's made easier, right? Because it's just amplifying everything that you're doing. You're not trying to actually manipulate or change. And, and that's not to say that good businesses don't get caught in challenges every day. We know that they do. Intention doesn't necessarily mean it's delivered in the outcome that you would desire always. But I have to think that opportunity is there for better businesses to perform better in an environment under greater scrutiny.
Yeah, 100% agree. And in a world which is increasingly saturated by the artificial, I think people will inherently be drawn to what is organic. And if you can show up and face up and be that really human voice, you stand apart from whether it's your competition or whoever you're up against. You really do have that opportunity to cut through, and ironically, it doesn't require anything fancy. It requires you to just show up as a human being, be transparent, and engage with whoever it is that you're engaging with, your customers, your communities, whoever. And I think that's an enormous opportunity right now for organizations to be able to set themselves apart from their peers.
I think the opportunity, I'll come at it kind of slightly differently. I think we need to build fluency and awareness in the boardrooms and with senior executive leaders around this issue, because 75% of experts who study the information environment have warned it's going to get worse. I think this week, the world's best digital forensics expert said, "I no longer trust my own eyes." So the implications of what this means and the kind of challenges that we're all going to have to deal with are going to change and become more difficult to grapple with. So I would say your board needs to have a level of awareness and fluency. Your exec teams need to have a level of awareness and fluency. As communicators or corporate affairs teams, you need to have a level not only of awareness, but intelligence. You need to be able to see this information environment in 3D. And then, be flexible. You may have to change how you operate, how you coordinate with teams, how you respond in a crisis. So I think the opportunity is reinvention, but that comes through the hard work.
Okay, so feel like I've asked 1,000 questions. I'm going to turn it over to the room. Who has a question for our wonderful panel?
Thank you so much. Hi there. Thank you for your presentation. Fantastic. Thanks. Lisa, I wanted to come back to you and the need for people to eat their information vegetables. The bit that you said after that I thought was particularly interesting, that you need to be able to package that information up. I don't think that was your words, but something like that, and create engagement at scale. So that's a bit that's really interesting. How do we do it?
Well, there are organizations that are trying. And so I think, if you look at, I'm a big fan of actually the Daily Oz here. I think they've done a great job of, they certainly want to be a serious player in news, but they are communicating in a way that they like to be communicated with for their particular age group. The trick is for them is what happened was Facebook pulled out news in protest to the social media ban or news bargaining code. And so they lost their audience. So I think it's a full stack approach to answer your question of how we do it. There's a government question to be had. We need better frameworks and regulation on the system. We need more imagination of what formats work. And I think, there was a conversation yesterday of, what's that hybrid model in between influencer and kind of journalist. And there is a production issue. So I'm seeing some interesting things where there are companies that are using AI in really interesting ways to be able to surface information and kind of scale at speed. But I don't want to talk in too much depth about them because they're just pilots at the moment. But I think AI might play a role. I wish I could be nicer.
Thanks, Pat. This one's for Kristian. Hello, my name is Annabelle. I'm from Are You OK? I just wanted to revisit around disclosure of AI. It's one we're talking about a lot internally, whether that's kind of in end-to-end production or the initial stages. But is there anyone that's doing it well, in your opinion? And particularly in terms of, we've got long form content, but in short form content on social places like that, is there anyone that's doing it well that you're keeping an eye on?
This is very left of field, but there are quite a few fashion brands that I've seen that have really done incredible campaigns that are just, you'll see like an enormous like bag, like, going through like it's really impactful, it's really eye-catching, and they're not shying away from the fact that it's AI. I think that's a way that the fashion industry is doing it very well. Then you see ways that they're not doing it so well, and you see other brands which have done campaigns that have used AI models, and you see the scandal come out where someone will say, I'm a model, and they've used my likeness in this like upcoming campaign. That's not me, it was AI. So I think it's going to be very, very different depending on what industry that you're in. And I feel like it lends itself, going back to what I was saying earlier, AI for delivering a final product lends itself far more to some organizations than others. For others, it will be a research tool. For some, it'll be to generate the end product. I think the way that you do it and the way that you disclose it is incredibly important. And there are two ways of which it was done well and another way in which it was not done so well.
Also, just to pick up on that point a little bit, we've found that if the questions that you're asking in that design element of where you're going to use AI or disclose the usage of it is what would a human expect to see. So in that kind of in that fashion example, where it is that eye-catching things that feel like they'd be very expensive to do, there's a connection and understanding there from an audience that's okay. They've done that in a different way. If you are using it to actively replace a human or to actively replace what should feel like human-to-human communication, that's where that there can be that little bit of hesitation and combat around whether or not that's the right thing to do. So sometimes it's that audience question first of, would this be a human? Would my audience or my community be upset that this doesn't feel like a human?
Thanks. Hi, great presentation. My name's Zena. I'm from Paper and Spark. We're a digital comms and marketing agency, and the biggest amount of queries we're seeing at the moment from either comms teams or brands is what should they be doing now that Google's just killed search, and how do they build trust? Now there are zero-click search results. Google has launched AI search queries. How do they appear in LLMs, and what are you seeing that organisations are doing to grapple with this particular challenge?
This is the gazillion, I think it's $80 billion question. I was talking to someone in London recently, and they said, we're watching the SEO pivot to GEO. I'm actually at this stage kind of skeptical on what's possible because no one really knows how the neural network actually works. So trying to manipulate that in a consistent way, challenging. There will be, some progress, but I wouldn't put all of my money in that basket. The short thing that I would say is that I think there's going to be this interim period that's going to be really challenging for a lot of organizations, and if they were news organizations, where they're seeing their traffic go down by 40%. I've heard numbers as high as 80%. And I think for organizations that are doing generic news or any kind of organization that's just pumping out generic content, it's probably going to be existential. I think the only thing that will save you from these LMMs are, originality. And I think one of the best quotes that I heard is, journalism is what happens outside the internet. So somebody has to write the first draft of history. Somebody, so I think originality is going to be very important. But financially, I don't have an economic answer to that problem, and it keeps me up at night. Yeah.
I think there's also, just to touch on the idea of reputation within LLMs, the idea of GEO is really complex because the optimization part is a very hard question to answer at the moment, and there's a lot of claims to answer it, but they're not transparent environments. If any of you have seen our AI view tool, that's very much designed to be an LLM reputation and citation measurement tool, just while we're in this interim space of a lot of these things are being figured out. A lot of these companies are pre-IPO and their behaviour will change when they have to monetize those environments differently. So there is a way to understand what the mix of information is and how influential it is, but then you need to balance that with that level of originality and how do you communicate in and around it to build that whole picture. But it is a really, I think, valuable starting point on knowing this is the mix of information. These are the things that are influential in my sector, in this country, in this particular city, just to get that lay of the land so that you know where you can and can't pivot and influence.
Thank you. Thanks so much, guys. Loved your insights. I was interested in what we sort of touched on the extent that paywalled content can and can't influence LLM models. I work in PR, and one of our huge value points is how we can secure coverage on credible news sites to then boost reputation and influence LLMs as well. I assume it differs for each tool. But what kind of paywall content can earn its place on, chat, and what can't, if you know?
Look, I'm not expert in the back end of these things. Usually, if it's with a media entity, that is going to be, you may not get to the full depth of the content, but it can be surfaced. When I was speaking more earlier, it was around like deeper pieces of academic and scientific research, which does tend to sit and not pop up in those searches as much. And so that's where, I think that we have the potential to miss out on some of that depth of information if we're only activating in those spaces. I'm not sure how valid this is. I think we were talking here that in Australia it's not so much the case, but in America they are saying that LLMs pull from about 95% of content is from media and other sources like that. So there is this desire, therefore, to seek out credible coverage and journalistic coverage that will then feed into those. You were conveying that here in Australia, you think that number is definitely not as high.
It is definitely lower. I think that we know that model preference is to pull from those sources, but the paywall restrictions are really significant. One of the best ways to look at it and keep track of it is to understand essentially who is suing who and who has signed a deal with who. If you take, I think there are 9 different licensing lawsuits active against Perplexity at the moment. That's CNN, News Corp, everyone is suing them for using their content. I think being able to do a level of auditing around that and understanding where the baseline is, but we actually see in Australia particularly, it is maybe around 35% of citations that are used are drawing from traditional media sources. So sometimes it's that pivot of actually this space isn't important in this ecosystem. It's still important in others, but where we need to concentrate here is in your industry voices, in what subreddits are most influential, seeing where that space is, because we do find right now that that's different. And again, everything with AI is very changeable. So as those licensing deals do or don't get figured out, or some kind of legal precedent is set about the ownership of that content, that will change how that feeds. But right now, that's what we're seeing.
Maybe final question. I just can't stop thinking about the boring truth vegetables. If social media and news media predominantly are our candy stores, but we need more boring truth vegetables out there, where is the place for it? Because I'm sure a lot of comms people hear of, we've got a gold mine of boring truth vegetables, but news just won't take it. So where does that get cut through? What's the channel for that, and how do we keep feeding the world boring truth vegetables?
I'm going to live to regret saying that here.
I know, KP's converted it to boring truth vegetables.
I'm a big fan of vegetables. I am hearing, so in the conversations that I'm having with people who are kind of, far ahead of where I am in this field, they're talking about whole new digital infrastructures. So, will people fatigue of the candy store, just to keep the analogy going? Like, will we just get that sugar high and then that sugar crash? And are we going to look for other platforms, other ways in which we can be informed? And I think, to your point with the influencers and with young people looking for kind of trusted sources in that report yesterday, the one thing that we do know is that after Bondi, they didn't go to the influencers. They kind of knew to go to kind of trusted, verified news. To your question of, I've got a stack of boring vegetables I need to get out and I need to get eyeballs on, I would look to organizations that are doing that well, and there are a few, and kind of learning from them. And I can kind of talk to you afterwards about who I think some of those are. But a lot of it comes down to like kind of production, storytelling, how do you get scale? There's a really interesting work being done in memes at the moment. So I think, that there are some ways, but there's no easy hack because of how the algorithms are kind of biased towards maximum attention. We know what holds our attention: anger, fear, outrage. So that content that triggers that emotional response is always going to be elevated. And that's what we need to tackle at the governance level.
Any other final questions before we thank our panel? Oh yeah, one more.
Hello, I'm Nicole from IAG. Thanks for sharing your insights today. Really interesting discussion. Just ruminating over everyone else's questions around LLMs. We're obviously all in the same position right now. And whilst we don't know the ins and outs of GEO and how these LLMs algorithms are working, and they're changing constantly, like, what would you say though are the foundational things that comms teams should be doing right now to at least put your best foot forward in kind of, doing everything we can to make sure that our brands and organisations are being kind of accurately and hopefully positively represented in these AI search systems?
I'll take this one. I think looking at some of the great work that Isentia is doing around where the LLMs are preferencing for their sources, and it's really interesting to see that one of the top preferences is the humble, your own humble organizational website. It's something that, for a lot of us is set up years ago and, updated periodically, but it's really having its moment again and being able to go through and do an audit and make sure that the information there is valuable, credible, and really tells your story. I think that's going to be something as we, start moving into the era, or we're already in it, the era of the no-click Google search. That information being surfaced is the first thing that someone sees when they ask, tell me about this organization. Having your own message out there, at the forefront, it's how long this window will last for. remains to be seen. But we have a golden opportunity to be able to tell our own story with no resistance whatsoever, because it's our own webpage from our own organisation, and we control it.
Yeah, I mean, my biased response to that would be it is a measurable thing. It has boundaries, but I think that the biggest, instinctual change to make at the moment is that I think we've all spent a really long time going quite deep into channels and meeting people where they are and finding those micro audiences. What you need to do in an LLM environment is really look at that whole picture of, if I was a model that is trying to pull from as many different sources as possible that feel like they're authoritative, what would that story tell me? Like, what is the most consistent thing that's said about you? Because it's the consistency that is what is valued here. It's consistency, authority, and access. So it's being able to take that step back and go, okay, so if I was looking at this from a more macro messaging perspective, what is that likely to be, and how would that be different depending on the different brands that I'm looking at, or the different sectors? So it's a slightly different lens to that more direct channel or owned asset measurement. Okay.
Can I end on just
Of course.
a slight personal plug? I really, in a lot of the work that I do, care about gender equity. And we've done work together with Isentia for an organization called Women in Media that I work with. We did a gender scorecard. And basically looking at media coverage, it time and again surfaces that about 60% of the time it's male voices, male spokespeople, male experts that are in the fore. So as communications individuals, I think you guys hold a huge amount of power for the diversity of the voices that get to speak for your companies and on issues that matter. And I would just encourage you in this new environment. And we know that AI has been so developed based on the bias that already exists in society, which is so male skewed, to think about women, think about diverse voices, who you are supporting in your organizations, and the tone that comes through, and the representation and the power that holds. Thank you.
Yes, I love that. I would also add that there are some statistics showing that there is a higher level of distrust of AI among women, and a less likelihood to use AI and be in active leadership about AI as a woman. So as a number of women in this room, please don't be afraid of pushing in your organizations, developing, leading, being at the forefront of what AI looks like in your organization. But on that, please join me in thanking our panel this morning. You can find a few more resources at that QR code there, including some of our previous webinars on the topic. But please do stay around if you have any questions directly for the panel or any of the Isentia team. But thank you all for coming today.